My name is Josephine Budge. I'm an artist, a writer, a scholar, and a pleasure activist. I move around a lot, but a lot of the time I'm based in northeast London, in Dalston, where I was born. And my arts practice really is very interdisciplinary. I am a writer kind of first and foremost. I have a speculative writing practice. So I write short stories, I write longer stories, I write speculative essays, and I use speculative art writing in my installation and visual arts practice, which means that there could be all manner of letters, poetics, fragments of thought, text that becomes distorted through water or is vinyled onto glass. And I really try to think quite expansively about text as a visual object across film and sculpture, and then more traditional kind of writing itself. The rural actually plays quite a key role in lots of my work, even or especially the work that I do in urban centres, because of course the rural can exist in urban centres as well. There can be spaces of cultural and state-funded isolation in urban spaces, which feel very rural and deal with a lot of the same issues that rural spaces might deal with. So I think about what audiences and communities have access to. In the spaces that I work, I think about who my work is speaking to and speaking for. I'm doing a project right now in a cemetery park in London, which feels very rural, and there's definitely lots of conversations that I've had with my collaborators about how to invite local communities into that space, even though they kind of live alongside it. It doesn't necessarily feel like it's for them. But also the rural plays a huge part in my role because I have a great need of being outside in vast, expansive green spaces. I grew up all over the place, but lots in the southwest, in the countryside in England, and also in Ghana, where my family are from, in the countryside and by the beach. And leaving the urban centre is really essential for me to be able to have space to have a creative practice, and also because I collaborate a lot with non-human species in my work. So I wrote a whole piece that was kind of co-created with this incredible tree in Utrecht in the Netherlands a few years ago. And so I really kind of seek out my collaborators in non-urban spaces as well. So I leave urban centres where I get some of my cultural and social needs and enter rural spaces to make art really frequently. And that means being in a completely different environment, of course, in terms of the human makeup of those spaces, but also in terms of the environmental and non-human makeup of those spaces. So I always really try to plug into what's happening environmentally. I mean, there are so many extreme spaces of toxicity and confrontation between humans and non-human environments at the moment. Usually in rural areas where I'm working, there are battles that are going on against housing developments or railway infrastructure expansion or mines or fracking or the kind of building of windmills that are then causing issues for people who have hearing disabilities or various sensitivities to noise and sound. And of course airports, always airports and runways being built in particularly impoverished or black and brown communities where there is more likely to be young people with asthmatic conditions. I really try to tap into all the complex ecologies that are going on in a space, social, political, historical, and then of course there are the historical ecologies that are erased and disavowed from often much more in rural spaces. So where the money came from, what was traded at that port, or where those various species come from, right? Were they kind of imported during times of colonial exchange or theft? And then there's the kind of pressure to respond to these more violent histories, which is something that I navigate because I think it is important to speak to and expose and reference those histories, particularly for all the unnamed peoples and ecologies that were the victims of those systems. But I also think that can be very constraining as an artist. So I also kind of fight for the right to work in rural spaces without being the black artist who's responding to the colonial history of that space, because our entire island is soaked in very violent colonial histories, and they should be everybody's responsibility to respond to and expose. So I'm really interested in other artists that work rurally, both across the UK and transoceanically, and also artists that challenge, again, what this kind of false binary between urban and rural spaces are. So 3 artists in particular that have influenced my practice and that come to mind are Angela Chan, who is a beautiful curator and mixed media artist who thinks wonderfully with moss, very intimately and delicately. And I think she's done a lot of really incredible work in rural spaces in Northern England, and thinking a lot and talking a lot about the ways in which she's kind of forced to come to urban centres to get funding or to kind of build diverse audiences, but also then continues to kind of forge the importance of working rurally and working also in the spaces where her parents live and her community live, and not kind of abandoning those spaces. Feral Practice is another really amazing artist who works rurally, who lives in Kent but works all over the UK, and again kind of works really beautifully with various forms of microecology, so mushrooms and soil composites and leaf patterns, but forges kind of quite interestingly accountable spaces, I'd say, which is also something that I think is really important in rural spaces, is saying, you know, this also needs to be an intersectional space, this also needs to be an intersectional conversation, even if I'm working, you know, potentially in an all-white community, which many spaces in England are all-white communities, rural spaces. So I really kind of respect the way that she thinks in her practice. And then lastly, Alberta Whittle, who is a Bayesian Scottish artist who's based in Glasgow, but has worked kind of all across Scotland and the UK and the world. But I think particularly her work across Scotland is really extraordinary, not least because she is a black Scottish woman who in my experience doesn't allow that to stop her from working in quite remote and rural spaces when the work feels like it needs to exist there. So much of her arts practice speaks to, again, this false binary of urban and rural, but also the idea that there are certain spaces in which race can be discussed and that rural is not one of them. And I think she really speaks back to that notion or that narrative, and forces us to interrogate the racial, complex, political, historical remnants and residues all over this island, again in rural areas as well as urban ones.